At the funeral, a canine dog jumped onto the veteran's body. What happened next left everyone in tears. The chapel was draped in silence, not the kind born of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that blankets the air when grief walks in uninvited and refuses to leave. Soldiers lined the pews, rows of rigid shoulders and blank stares, their uniforms pressed and pristine, as if by remaining sharp they could keep the sorrow from cutting too deep. Outside, the flag hung at half-mast, fluttering only slightly in the still wind, as though even the elements dared not disturb what was happening inside. At the front of the chapel stood the polished casket of Sergeant Elijah Calloway, draped with the American flag. His service had ended not with ceremony, but with the sudden, sharp finality that only war could deliver. For his comrades, it was another name added to a long list of brave souls. For his sister Margaret, it was the end of the last family she had left. And for one silent figure sitting in the back of the room, it was something far more Orion. The war dog who had fought beside him, who had bled with him, who had laid beside him in quiet nights in war zones, watching the world fall apart from behind tired, watchful eyes. Orion sat beside his handler, a young Marine who had been assigned to keep him calm through the ceremony. The dog's posture was rigid, his eyes fixed on the flag-draped box as if waiting for it to rise and command him once more. But it wouldn't, and when the pallbearers began their slow, reverent march down the aisle, bringing Elijah to his final resting place beneath the vaulted ceilings of the old church, Orion moved. No one saw the moment his restraint snapped, not violently, but inevitably. The leash slipped through fingers, a whisper of tension lost. Orion surged forward, not running but walking with purpose, each paw step deliberate, echoing on the old wooden floor. He leaped lightly, lightly, like he'd done so many times into helicopters, into Humvees, into trenches, but this time it was onto the casket. He did not bark, he did not growl, he simply lay down on Elijah's chest, the weight of him pressing gently as if trying to remind the body beneath the flag that he was still here, still ready. And then the sound came, a low, keening whimper, rising from Orion's throat like smoke from a dying fire. It filled the chapel. That soft, broken sound, the raw grief of an animal who could not be told that death is permanent. People wept. Even the hardest soldiers blinked away tears. The bugler hesitated with his trumpet halfway to his lips, and in the midst of it, something small slipped free from the creases of Elijah's uniform. A piece of paper, folded, yellowed slightly as if it had been carried close to the heart for many weeks. It landed near the foot of the casket with a nearly imperceptible rustle. Margaret was the first to notice. She stepped forward, trembling, bent down, and picked up the note. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably Elijah's. The words on the outside read simply, "For Orion, my last order." Her breath caught, with trembling fingers. She opened it. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I have only one final order. Stop guarding now, my friend. Your mission is over." The note trembled in her hands. She dropped to her knees beside the casket, tears spilling down her cheeks as she read the words aloud in a whisper, then tucked the note gently into the small pouch on Orion's collar, the one where Elijah used to keep emergency commands. "You carry his last words now," she whispered. "He trusted you until the end." Orion remained still, his eyes closed, body unmoving except for the occasional twitch of his ears. But everyone in that chapel knew he understood. He wasn't mourning like a pet. He was saluting like a soldier. After the funeral, one of Elijah's old squad mates approached Margaret quietly. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low, "in the days before the funeral. Orion, he acted strange, wouldn't eat, kept sitting in front of Elijah's house, digging in the backyard." "Digging?" she asked. He nodded. "Same spot every time. We thought it was stress. But then I remembered that's where Elijah used to sit at night, to write, to train Orion, to stargaze." Margaret didn't speak. She couldn't, because in that moment she realized the truth Orion had known. Maybe not in words, maybe not in the way people understand, but in the language of instinct, of bond, of heart. He had known Elijah was never coming home. That night, When the bugle finally played taps, and the honor guard folded the flag into a tight triangle, handing it to Margaret with solemn precision. Orion didn't move, but as the casket began its slow descent into the ground, he raised one paw, slowly, gently, and placed it atop the wood. A final salute, a goodbye. The crowd froze, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy with sorrow. It was reverent. It was sacred. In the days that followed, Orion was sent to a canine retirement facility for military dogs, a peaceful compound in the countryside where aging war dogs could spend their final years in safety. But something strange began to happen. Every morning at precisely 5:47 a.m., the exact time Elijah had used to begin their first patrol together, Orion would awaken. He would not eat. He would not rest. He would break free from his enclosure, bypass every attempt to stop him, and return to the cemetery. No one knew how he navigated there, over 10 miles away. But he would appear, like clockwork, and lie in the exact spot where Elijah was buried. Eyes open, still, waiting, as if still guarding, as if still obeying an order only he could hear. 1 week later, Margaret received a package from one of Elijah's former comrades. Inside was Elijah's old military field journal. Dusty, worn, the leather cover cracked from years of weather. As she flipped through the final pages, she found a note scrawled in Elijah's unmistakable hand. "If I don't make it back, tell Orion this: I wasn't his trainer. I was just someone who learned how to love from a creature who knew how to fight without hatred." She pressed the journal to her chest and wept, not just for the brother she had lost, but for the invisible thread between man and beast that had shaped his final days. Days later, Margaret drove to the cemetery early in the morning. The mist still clung to the ground, and the sunrise painted the sky in hues of soft amber and gray. There, lying as always at the grave, was Orion, his body still, his eyes alert, the pouch still around his neck. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. He looked up at her, not with confusion, not with sadness, but with calm understanding. "I'm carrying out my last order," that look seemed to say, "until someone else is ready to take my place." And in that gaze, Margaret saw something: eternal loyalty not bound by death, duty not broken by time, and love, love that never needed words to be understood. The winter deepened, and with it, the silence at Elijah's old home grew heavier, like snow accumulating on the roof until beams began to strain beneath its weight. Margaret had returned after the funeral not to grieve in solitude, but because it felt like the last place where Elijah's voice might still echo. The porch still creaked beneath her feet in the same rhythm it always had. The wind still pushed the swing that hung from the rafters, and when the sun set behind the hills, the light struck the corner of the backyard where Elijah had always sat with Orion, as if time hadn't moved forward at all. She found herself walking those familiar steps each morning, fingers brushing the tops of the white pickets, boots leaving the same pattern of prints in the frozen grass as her brother once had. But there was something more, a thread she hadn't quite unraveled, a feeling that something remained unfinished. That morning, as frost glazed the windows and Orion failed to return at his usual hour, Margaret stood in Elijah's room, staring at the footlocker by his bed. It was military issue, scratched and dented from years of travel, the brass latch still bearing the slight bend from when Orion had once sat on it as a puppy. She hadn't opened it since the funeral, she hadn't dared. But now something compelled her. When she unlatched it, a faint scent of metal and pine drifted upward: gun oil, field rations, notes on folded pages. His journals were there, more than one. A file folder labeled Orion Operations. Photographs, most faded, some torn at the edges. One showed Elijah kneeling beside Orion in the desert, dust in their hair, both squinting into the sun with that look of shared exhaustion only those in combat knew. Beneath the folder, a rolled-up map caught her eye. It wasn't military, it was hand-drawn. At first glance, it looked like a sketch of a park or rural land. But when she unrolled it on the table and flattened its corners with coffee mugs, she saw it clearly: their backyard, the garden, the tool shed, the hill that overlooked the woods, and marked with red X's specific spots. One of which was where Orion had been digging before the funeral. Her breath caught. She grabbed her coat, laced her boots, and marched into the snow, following the lines on the map like they were etched in memory. The first red X was beneath the old oak tree by the fence. The ground was frozen, but she remembered the shape of Orion's hole. It had been neat, purposeful, not the frantic clawing of a confused animal, but the deliberate search of a creature that knew what it was looking for. She began to dig, her fingers numb despite the gloves, the shovel heavy in her hands. 10 minutes in, she hit something solid, metal, a small, rusted tin box. She pulled it free, brushed off the snow, and opened the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of Orion, in uniform, in training, in rest. But beneath the stack was a single sheet of paper, folded crisply, its edges browned. It was another letter. This one addressed to the one who finds this Orion story, Part 1. Her breath fogged the air as she read it. Elijah's handwriting again, a little steadier this time. You think I trained him. You think I molded him into a tool of war. The truth is I only ever followed his lead. Orion never learned what to do. He already knew. He watched me and decided I was worth protecting. He chose me. The things you saw him do, the instincts, the timing, it wasn't training. It was something deeper. And I think he's leaving clues now. Not for the world, but for the one who still listens. If you are reading this, you found the first. There are more. Follow them. Margaret stood motionless, the wind sliding across her face like the whisper of something long past. She clutched the letter to her chest and looked out across the field. There were 3 more red X's. She didn't return to the house, not yet. The next X was by the hill with the broken fence, there, buried beneath an old, hollow log. She found another tin, this one containing a small leather collar, Orion's first, the one he wore before he was deployed. Attached to it was a metal tag, not the usual identification, but a military insignia with strange markings etched into the back, Euro 547. The time, the ritual, the silent devotion. She was starting to see it now. Orion hadn't simply been mourning. He had been tracing memories, reenacting something sacred. She pressed forward to the next site, this one beneath the base of the wind chime that Elijah had once said reminded him of home during deployment. The box here was heavier. Inside was a cassette tape, yes, an old tape and a note. Play this when you're ready to hear him the way I did. Back inside. She dusted off Elijah's old stereo system, miraculously still working. The tape hissed to life, and then his voice filled the room. Day 43, Camp Marlow. Orion woke me before dawn again. Sat by the flap until I opened it. Dragged me outside with that look in his eye, like something was wrong. 15 minutes later, the supply truck behind us exploded. We would have been in its path. I don't know how he knew. He just did. The guys call it luck. I call it Orion. The tape continued, dozens of short recordings, days, places, memories, each one a whisper into the dark. Meant for no one and yet now meant for her. Orion wasn't just a dog. He had been Elijah's compass, his shield, his confessor. The final red X was in the shed. It took her hours to dig beneath the floorboards. But when she did, she found the last box. This one was different. Inside was another letter, and a photograph of Elijah, aged, grizzled, older than when he died. But it was drawn in charcoal, as if imagined, on the back. A note I thought I'd have time to grow old, to see the world with him by my side, not in battle, but in peace. That's the dream I leave behind. Orion deserves to find it. Margaret folded the letter and stared into the silence of the shed. Outside, the sun was setting, 5:46 p.m. A full day had passed, and Orion hadn't returned. She stepped out onto the porch, heart thudding, eyes scanning the distant tree line. And then, just before the second hand clicked over, he appeared, like a ghost parting the mist, his paws steady, his breath visible in the twilight. He walked to her, sat at her feet, and looked up. She knelt slowly, brushing the snow from his fur, eyes locked with his. I found them, she whispered. Every one. Orion blinked, slow and deliberate. Then he did something unexpected. He stood, turned, and began walking not to the grave, not to the patrol route, but toward the woods. He stopped, looked back once, an invitation. Margaret hesitated and then followed. Together, they disappeared into the trees. The first steps towards something neither of them fully understood, yet both somehow already knew. The mission wasn't over. It was just changing shape. And the path ahead, it was one only they could walk, man and dog, soul and shadow, searching not for war, but for what comes after. The forest loomed in quiet solemnity, its trees bare like rows of ancient sentinels, their branches clawing at the pale winter sky. The ground crackled underfoot with a thin crust of snow and brittle leaves. Yet Orion moved with effortless grace, silent, measured, each step placed with instinctual precision as if following tracks no human eye could see. Margaret followed close behind, heart pounding, her boots clumsy beside the padded silence of her companion. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't need to. The look in his amber eyes before he turned had been enough. It wasn't a whim or a wandering. It was purpose, and so, without map or destination, they ventured deeper into the woods that bordered the property where Elijah had grown up, lived, left, and returned to only in death. The wind whispered through the branches above them, sighing like voices just out of reach. And still Orion pressed forward. Occasionally, he would stop, nose lifted to the air, head tilting as though catching a sound Margaret could not hear. Then he would resume, cutting a line through bramble and slope with uncanny confidence. After nearly an hour, they emerged into a clearing Margaret had never seen before, a wide circle, rimmed with stone and moss, where the trees thinned and the light fell in broken shafts across a cluster of rocks at its center. Orion stopped, sat, and looked back at her. Margaret stepped forward, eyes scanning the formation. At first it looked like random boulders, but then her gaze adjusted. Someone had carved into them faint, almost erased with time. Letters, initials, dates. She dropped to her knees before one. EC, 2003. Another EC plus MC she drew in her breath. Elijah Calloway. And their mother she remembered vaguely. A story Elijah once told her about a place their parents had taken them camping when they were children. A spot Elijah had claimed as his base and refused to leave, insisting it was magical. He had begged their father to build a fort here someday. They never did. Life had moved on, but Elijah had come back, again and again, carving time into stone. "You brought me here," she whispered, brushing the moss gently from the rock. Orion patted beside her, nudging her shoulder with his nose. Then he turned, trotted a few paces, and began digging near the base of a tree. Margaret didn't stop him. She didn't ask. She joined him, pushing aside the frost with her gloved hands, scooping soil until her fingers struck something solid. A box. She pulled it free. Unlike the tins, this one was wood, old, handmade. It creaked as she opened it, revealing a stack of papers, photographs, and a small velvet pouch. She reached for the pouch first. Inside was a ring, Elijah's, the one he had worn only once after returning from his first tour. He never said why he took it off. She slipped it onto her thumb and turned to the papers. At the top was a letter, dated only weeks before his last mission. If you're reading this, it means you followed him. Good, that means you're listening now. I didn't tell anyone about this place, not the army, not command, not even you. Maggie, it was ours once, and I kept it that way. I needed somewhere untouched, somewhere I could be human again. Orion always knew how to find it. He brought me here after every deployment. Sometimes. I think he needed it more than I did. The letter continued, detailing memories she had never heard, quiet nights beneath the stars with just a campfire, and Orion curled beside him. Mornings spent sketching the shapes of birds, afternoons training but without commands, just movement and trust. Elijah had built something here, not of wood or stone, but of healing. And now Orion had brought her here too, not just to show her, to pass it on. She felt the weight of it settle into her chest, the realization that this wasn't just a path of grief. It was a trail of legacy, one only she and Orion had been invited to walk. That night, she made camp in the clearing, curling beneath a thick blanket near the remains of a fire pit Elijah had built. Orion lay beside her, close but not touching, eyes always scanning the tree line. Somewhere deep in the night, She awoke to a sound not animal, not storm, but soft, like humming. She sat up, blinking, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw him, Elijah, sitting on the rock with his journal open, Orion at his feet, his face turned toward the sky. The image dissolved as her breath caught in her throat, but the warmth lingered, not in fear, not in pain, but in presence at dawn. Orion was already awake, sitting at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the path that led deeper into the woods. Margaret rose, packed the journal, the ring, and the remaining papers, and followed. They walked for most of the morning, crossing frozen creeks and passing rusted fences swallowed by time. Then, in the hush of midday, they came to a small, abandoned ranger station nestled between two hills. The door was rotted, the windows broken, but inside, beneath the dust and decay, lay signs of used paw prints in the dirt, claw marks on the frame, and in the corner, an old cot covered in dog hair and faded canvas. Orion sniffed the room, then lay down with a sigh, as if they had arrived not at a place but at a memory. Margaret sat beside him and opened the last of the letters. It was shorter than the rest. I always thought if I had to go, I'd want to leave something behind that wasn't just medals or folded flags. I wanted to leave a place, a path, and someone to carry it. If it's you reading this, Mags, then thank you for listening, for trusting him. Orion doesn't follow everyone. He only follows those he chooses, and if he brought you here, it means he's chosen again. Maybe not to guard, but to remember, to lead. Her throat tightened. The journal pages trembled in her hands. Orion shifted beside her, resting his head on her lap, and for the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to cry without restraint, not just for Elijah, but for everything lost, everything preserved, and everything still to come. Outside, the wind rose, scattering leaves across the forest floor. But inside, in the hush of that forgotten shelter, a new silence took root, not empty, not mournful, but waiting. Margaret looked down at the bond who had led her there, who had guarded her brother through fire and sand and silence. "You're not just a war dog," she whispered. "You're the keeper of his story." Orion didn't move, but his eyes opened, warm and golden and still so full of understanding it almost hurt to look. "And I think," she added, brushing a hand over his fur, "you're not done yet, and neither was she, not by a long shot." The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt older than memory, as if the forest itself remembered how to cradle the lives of those who chose to remain hidden within it. Margaret stayed in the old ranger station with Orion, rising with the sun and walking the surrounding trails by day, studying the contents of Elijah's journal by night. The little stove inside the cabin groaned when lit, but it warmed the single room enough for comfort, and Orion often lay curled beside it, his ears twitching in his sleep as if still listening to the sounds only he could decipher. Margaret had always known Elijah as her brave, sometimes reckless brother, the one who carried the weight of protection on his back like it was armor. But here, in his journals, she was beginning to know the other Elijah, the one who had loved silence, who had drawn trees in the margins of his field reports, who had marked Orion's milestones with more emotion than his own promotions. Page after page revealed layers of connection between man and dog that defied training protocols. Elijah didn't describe commands or obedience, but mutual instinct, mirrored action. He referred to Orion as his shadow stitched in loyalty, and in one passage, he wrote, "I don't lead him, we move together. He knows me better than I know myself. If I ever lose my way, he'll be the one to bring me back." Those words echoed in Margaret's mind each time Orion stopped abruptly on the trail and stared into the trees. Sometimes he would growl, low and quiet, not in fear but in alertness, and other times he would sit perfectly still, watching a patch of brush or a fluttering leaf with unnerving intensity. She followed his lead without question, learning to listen in new ways to the wind, to the snow, to the breath of the woods. On the fifth morning, Orion led her to a ridge overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking even in winter, the distant mountains rising like frozen waves against the horizon. Margaret sat on a boulder with the journal in her lap, and Orion stood beside her, tail still, eyes locked on something she couldn't see. "What are we looking for today?" she asked softly, brushing snow from the page. Orion didn't answer, but she felt the tension in his frame. She opened to a new entry dated just a month before Elijah's death. It began with coordinates, followed by a single sentence. "If something happens, someone needs to see what's there." Her heart skipped. She pulled out her phone and entered the coordinates. The spot was 5 miles south, deeper into a stretch of forest known for rough terrain and old, crumbling mining trails. Margaret closed the journal and looked at Orion. "You ready?" He looked back at her with that familiar steadiness, stood, and began walking. The hike was harder than anything they'd done before. The snow was deeper, the air sharper, and the sun hung lower, casting longer shadows. Orion navigated with uncanny precision, always a few steps ahead but never out of sight. Margaret's legs ached by the 3rd mile, and her breath came in visible puffs, but she kept going, driven by a mixture of duty and something more, a magnetic pull toward whatever Elijah had hidden. Near the 4th mile, the path disappeared beneath tangled branches and frostbitten vines. Orion didn't hesitate. He ducked under, emerged through, and waited on the other side. Margaret crawled after him, pushing through the growth until the landscape opened unexpectedly into a small clearing. At the center stood the remnants of an old outpost. Nothing more than a wooden shack collapsed under the weight of time. A rusted satellite dish jutted from the snow like a grave marker. She stepped forward, heart thudding. Orion approached a half-buried door in the ground beside the ruins, sniffed it, and then sat. Margaret brushed away the snow to reveal a hatch, sealed with an old padlock. She hesitated, then reached into her pack and pulled out the small key that had come with Elijah's last letter. One she hadn't yet found a use for. It fit. The lock clicked open. She pulled the hatch with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The air that wafted up smelled of dust and metal and memory. She clicked on her flashlight and began to descend. Orion followed without a sound. The basement was small, no more than 20 feet across, lined with metal shelves and a single desk. On the wall hung photographs, military units, landscapes, and one of Elijah standing with Orion, both silhouetted against the sunset. Beneath it was a corkboard covered in notes, maps, and clipped newspaper articles. Her eyes scanned them, and a cold realization crept in. Elijah hadn't just been visiting this place, he'd been tracking something. The articles detailed missing service dogs, reports of PTSD-related canine euthanizations, failures in military canine retirement support. The maps were marked with circles around facilities, names of handlers, timelines. Elijah had been investigating, quietly, alone. One note stood out. "We trust them with our lives, then abandon them when they can no longer serve. How many have we lost without ever knowing?" Margaret's throat tightened. This wasn't a personal refuge. It was an archive, a statement, a warning. Orion padded to the desk and nudged a box beneath it. She pulled it out and opened it to find dozens of files, dog names, handler IDs, service records, medical reports. One caught her eye: Athena, decommissioned 2018, missing. The image was of a black shepherd with eyes so familiar they could have belonged to Orion's twin. He was trying to save them. She whispered. Orion whined softly. They sat in the silence of the bunker for what felt like hours, the weight of Elijah's mission pressing down like the ceiling itself. Margaret ran a finger over the notes, the maps, the images of dogs who had no graves, no funerals, no folded flags. And she understood now Elijah hadn't died just as a soldier. He had died as a witness, as a protector of those who couldn't speak. And he had passed that task on to Orion, and to her. When they returned to the cabin that night, Margaret spread the documents across the table. She cataloged them, scanned them, made copies. She started writing emails. She started making calls. The ranger station transformed from a memory shrine to a command post. And Orion, ever watchful, resumed his quiet patrols, always circling the perimeter, always returning to sit at her side when the lamp burned low. One night, as she sat typing into the flickering laptop, She felt a sudden stillness in the air. She turned to find Orion standing in the doorway, staring out into the dark, ears forward. "What is it?" she whispered. Then she saw. At the edge of the tree line stood a figure, not a person, but a dog, a black shepherd, emaciated, trembling, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Orion didn't bark. He stepped forward, slow and low, tail wagging gently. The figure stepped closer. Margaret rose and walked to the door. The shepherd collapsed before reaching them, body limp from exhaustion. Orion lowered his head and licked its face once, then twice. A ritual, a recognition. Margaret dropped to her knees, heart breaking. Around the dog's neck was a faded tag. Athena. Elijah had been right. And now, his mission had found its first rescue. The war wasn't over. Not for them, not yet. But now there were two soldiers still standing, one with hands, one with paws, and a list of names waiting in the cold. The snow had begun to melt when the first response came in a terse, bureaucratic email stamped with the insignia of the Department of Military Animal Affairs. Barely 2 lines long. "We have no current record of any canine unit designated Athena under active investigation. If you have further documentation, please forward it through proper channels." Margaret stared at the screen, jaw clenched, knuckles whitening on the edge of the desk. She had sent them files, pictures, scans of Elijah's notes, even the tag around Athena's neck. Still crusted in frost, engraved with a serial number the government now claimed had never existed. She looked over at the dog curled near the stove, Athena still fragile, but no longer shaking, her coat regaining luster under Margaret's care and under Orion's quiet, constant presence. He never left her side, not for meals, not even during storms. And Athena had begun responding in kind, licking his face with gratitude, tail wagging timidly whenever Margaret entered the room. The rescue had changed something in the air. Orion's movements had grown more deliberate, his eyes sharper, his routine tighter. He patrolled the clearing with renewed energy, as if he finally had reason to stay alert again. The weight of solitude that had followed Elijah's death was lifting not because the grief had gone, but because it now had direction. That night, Margaret opened the final pages of Elijah's journal. She hadn't dared before. It felt too much like turning the last page of him, closing a door she didn't know how to reopen. But now, with Athena breathing softly at her feet and Orion watching from the window like a sentinel reborn, she knew it was time. The handwriting in the final entry was jagged, hurried, smudged by what looked like water or maybe blood. It read, "If they find this place before you do, if Orion leads you here, it means I didn't finish what I started. But it also means he's chosen someone else too, you, Margaret. If it's you reading this, then I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything. I didn't want to burden you with ghosts, but the truth is, what we did to these dogs, the ones who served, who saved lives, who came back broken or never came back at all, it's unforgivable. They deserve more than a cage or a needle. They deserve to come home. I couldn't fix the system. But maybe you can show the world what they don't want to see. Use this place. Use my notes. Save the ones still out there. And trust Orion. He always knows the way." Margaret closed the journal and held it to her chest. The room was silent but for the crackle of the fire. Her tears came hot, fast, and silent. Not grief this time, but resolution. The next morning, she drove into town. She hadn't left the forest in weeks. Not since following Orion that first night. The world beyond the trees felt loud, full of static and indifference. But she had business now. She visited a local veterinarian, arranged a full health checkup for Athena, then stopped by the library, photocopied every page of Elijah's files, and uploaded them to a cloud drive. She created a website, simple, clean, titled The Forgotten Patrol. It included names, photos, testimonies from soldiers Elijah had interviewed, maps with marked areas where dogs had gone missing or died under questionable circumstances. She made videos raw, unpolished clips of Athena and Orion in the cabin, walking the trails, sleeping curled together under the stars. She narrated them in Elijah's words, overlaying his journal entries like a voice beyond the grave. Within 3 days, The site had thousands of views, messages poured in. Veterans, former handlers, animal rescue workers. Some shared similar stories. Others offered help. A woman from Colorado claimed she had been forced to surrender her military dog after discharge and had never been told what happened to him. A man from Alabama sent a shaky video of a malnourished shepherd limping along a fence line, tagged with a number that matched one of Elijah's files. Margaret responded to every message, organized the names, created a tracker. It was no longer just Elijah's mission. It was a movement, and still. Orion guided her. One evening, just as the last light faded behind the pines, Orion stood abruptly from where he lay beside the fire and bolted through the door. Margaret followed without hesitation, Athena trailing behind. He led them deeper into the woods than ever before, crossing streams and climbing rocky slopes until they reached a clearing lit only by moonlight. There, beneath a fallen tree, lay another dog, emaciated, trembling, its fur matted and tangled with burrs. Orion approached slowly, tail low, body bowed. Body. The dog lifted its head and let out a rasping whine. Margaret moved in beside them. Recognizing the pattern now, she didn't ask who this dog was. She didn't need to. Orion had found another. Over the next month, they rescued 3 more. Each had their own scars, physical, emotional, some so deep they flinched at shadows and barked at silence. But Orion was patient. He taught them through stillness, through presence. He showed them how to be part of a pack again. Margaret built enclosures around the cabin, reinforced the roof, repaired the generator. The old ranger station transformed into a sanctuary. Local volunteers came to help quiet. Reverent people who had read the stories online and felt something stir inside. They brought supplies, tools, blankets, food. One even offered to donate surveillance cameras, which Margaret used to monitor the perimeter and document the dog's progress. News outlets picked up the story. Former Sergeant's sister continues War Dog's mission after tragic death. The headlines were clumsy, but the sentiment reached people. Donations followed. Rescue centers reached out. Politicians did too, some to help, some to silence. Margaret didn't care. The movement had momentum now, and behind it was a weight no headline could capture. She made sure Elijah's name stayed at the heart of it. Every rescued dog wore a tag stamped with his initials. Every report submitted to oversight committees included quotes from his journals. Every time a dog came through the trees, filthy and shaking but alive, she whispered his name into the wind. Orion aged. She saw it in his slower gait, the way he took longer to rise after sleep, the white creeping along his muzzle. But his spirit never dulled. He remained the leader, the guide, the soul of their quiet rebellion. One spring morning, Margaret awoke to find him sitting at the edge of the porch, staring into the woods as he often did. She sat beside him, rested a hand on his back. "You did it," she said. "You found them. You kept your promise." He turned to look at her, eyes calm, golden, infinite. Then he stood, walked to the tree line, and lay down beneath the branches. The others followed. Athena, the rescues. They formed a loose circle around him, not touching, but near. As the sun rose through the canopy, its rays fell in dappled patterns across his fur. He closed his eyes, and Margaret knew. That night, she lit a fire in the clearing. The dogs lay silently around her. She placed Elijah's final journal into the flames and watched the pages curl and rise into ash. Not in erasure, but in release. The mission was no longer on paper. It lived now in paws that ran free, in hearts that knew trust again, and in a woman who once followed a war dog into the woods and found a cause that changed the world. She stayed in the cabin for a year, then 2. The sanctuary grew. The name Elijah Calloway became more than a memory. It became a vow, a standard, a story passed from handler to handler, soldier to soldier, dog to dog, and sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees and the fire burned low, Margaret would step outside and swear she saw 2 silhouettes near the clearing's edge, a man and a dog, walking side by side, silent and eternal, still on patrol, still keeping watch, still carrying out the last order.